When I was around 6 years old, we lived in a pretty old two-story house. Well, 2 stories plus a walk-in attic. It was a beautiful century home with a wraparound porch and second-floor balcony that overlooked a decent-sized backyard. The house was creepy, though, especially to a 6-year-old. It would constantly creak and moan, and I was always told by my parents that it's just the house settling. My older brother liked to scare me, so he convinced me the house was haunted and made up a story about some kid that died in the attic decades before we moved in. Real original, I know. After that, I always swore I could hear footsteps in the attic. It got so bad I couldn't sleep, and one night, as I was laying in bed, I saw something I'll never forget. Staring out into the dark hallway from my bed, I saw a tall, dark shape quickly move past my doorway. It wasn't just a shadow, though. It was a person, and it wasn't a person that should be there. It was way taller than my mom, and my dad wasn't home. It scared me so bad I immediately started to cry, but I couldn't move or call out to my mom, or even wake my brother up, who was right in the top bunk sleeping. I never saw anything else that night, but I'm certain I heard the back door open and close shortly after seeing the shape. My dad worked third shift, so I eventually convinced myself that he had come home to grab something and then went back to work, and I finally fell asleep. The thing is, I would have heard and seen him walk in front of my room in the opposite direction first. My room was between my parents' room and the stairs to the second floor, so if he came home and walked to his room, he had to pass my room. I had been awake all night before and never saw him, so it couldn't have been him. The next day, I told my parents, and my dad said he never came home, and they both assured me it was just my imagination. I continued to hear stuff all the time, but never saw anything. I was terrified of being alone in the house. I insisted to my parents that there was something in the house. Anyway, my dad ended up getting a job out of state, so we were moving, and my brother was having a go-away/birthday slumber party about a week before the move. I was still 6 at the time, and he was 11, so the slumber party was full of a handful of grade school boys doing typical early 90s slumber party stuff. Pizza, video games, movies, and scary stories. The only adult was my mom because my dad was at work. I was trying to be cool in front of the older kids, so I told my brother to tell his friends the stupid ghost story about the kid that died in our attic. He told the story, and all his friends were like, "Let's go see this ghost." I was thinking, what have I done? I'm gonna have to go up there with them now. I honestly don't remember ever being in the attic before, as it was unfinished and used only for storage. They convinced my mom to take us up there, and she was playing along with the ghost story fun. She grabbed a flashlight and started leading us up to the attic door. She opened the door and started slowly walking up the stairs without turning the lights on. Again, just putting on a show for us kids. As soon as she got to the top of the stairs and turned the corner into the actual attic, I heard her say, really more like scream, "Everyone downstairs and outside now." We practically tripped over ourselves running down 2 flights of stairs and out the back door. My mom was running right behind us, and near pushed us out of the way from the house and towards the neighbors. She was pounding on the neighbor's door until they answered, and immediately said, "I need to use your phone to call the police." She refused to tell any of us kids what she saw up there, but when my dad and the cops showed up, we heard her tell them. When she got to the top of the stairs and looked into the attic, she saw in the far corner what she described as a squatter's spot. A bunch of blankets piled up to make a bed, some clothes, a pair of shoes, and food wrappers everywhere. We didn't stay in the house another night. We rented a motel room and stayed there for the last week we lived in that town before moving to another state. Years later, I finally got the whole story. My parents never had a clue someone was literally living in our attic. They did admit, looking back, that there were things that were strange, but most of it got blamed on other people in the house that they knew about, when in reality, it was all this guy living in the attic. My mom would notice food missing, but assumed us kids ate it all. My dad found cigarette butts by the back porch, and was livid that my mom was smoking again. I was forever getting told to make sure I'd flush the toilet, because someone would always leave it yellow. The blankets he was using for a bed were just ones my mom had thrown out months ago. Stuff like that. I don't know how long it took to find him, but it turns out the attic dweller was a local guy who was mentally ill and lived with his mom. His mom would constantly lock him out of the house, and this guy had several houses he would break into and stay in to get out of the elements. The best they were able to determine is that he would climb the columns supporting the porch roof, and then the columns supporting the roof on the second floor balcony, and from the balcony roof, he could climb in through an unlocked attic window. According to him, he would come down into the house when he was sure no one was home to steal food and sometimes use the bathroom. I'll never forget seeing him that night. I know it was him. It was exactly like it looks in the movies, but it was real. Me, 6 years old, awake in my bed at midnight, staring out the door into the dark hallway, when all of a sudden an even darker shadow zips by. I was pregnant with my first child in 2001. Right before my due date, I was obviously really pregnant. I was shopping in Walmart, and I started to notice this woman on every aisle I went on. I would guess she was in her mid-30s. When I went to the baby section to look at clothes, she started asking me questions. At first they were common, like about the gender. Then the questions started getting strange. Was I married? Did we have a house or an apartment? She commented on my accent and was curious if we had anyone in the area visiting for the birth. I'm from Michigan and was stationed in Florida. It was just kind of odd. I was young, 20, but I was married and my husband and I were both active duty, living off base in a rental house. I just told her, yes, we were excited, and to have a good rest of her day. She then started actually following me, telling me her husband was outside the store and they could help me take my groceries to my house. That's when I got really nervous. I told her I was fine, thanks, that my husband was home and could help me. She then told me they had a big truck and that she would buy me a large baby item. I politely declined, and she was so insistent, becoming aggressive. She then offered to buy my husband a grill, since we didn't need any baby things. I was getting panicky at this point because I knew this lady was not right. I went to the checkout. So did she. She got out before me, and I watched her race walk out of the store. And sure enough, she and her husband were pulled along the curb at the front near the pop machines. They were in a beat-up, old yellow box truck. The husband rolled down the window and said, "We'd be happy to help you with that." I again declined and went to my car. I loaded up and watched for a minute. They didn't move, just watched me. As soon as I pulled out, they did too. I tore out of there, and they stayed behind me for a minute or two. I still drove around crying for about 30 minutes to make sure they were gone before I went home. I'm now 44, and that is the first and one of just a few times that I felt that level of fear in my life. This happened 3 months ago. A friend of mine bought a small house in a housing complex at the start of the year. She often heard her neighbor and his girlfriend arguing loudly, as did the other homes around them. One afternoon, she came home from work to police in an ambulance in her cul-de-sac. She came to find out that this neighbor had murdered his girlfriend. She told the police she still heard him yelling 2 days prior. However, When the investigator came to officially interview her, he told her that the girlfriend had advanced decomposition to the extent that they couldn't get fingerprints from her. Keep in mind, this was in the wintertime, which means he had been yelling at her corpse for a while. Scary part is, the police still didn't arrest him. He lived in the house until the girlfriend's brother evicted him, since the home was in her name. I have no idea why he wasn't immediately arrested. I think they were still investigating. Innocent until proven guilty, I guess. In my country, South Africa's justice system is also quite incompetent. My friend thinks it's possible that he got her hooked on drugs and she may have overdosed. However, he apparently told the investigator he wasn't home for the weekend, and he just found her like that when he got back on Monday, which isn't possible since the neighbors heard him yelling at her on Saturday morning. In my early 20s, my wife and I had a goal of climbing all of the 14,000-foot peaks in Colorado. We would typically hike up a decent portion of the peak the night before, set up a tent and camp out, and summit the next day. We were climbing Crestone Needle in August 2014, and set up camp before the tree line ended. We were in a remote wooded area near a creek that was raging pretty good at the time. No other campers around, no hikers seen going up or down, just super quiet and peaceful. We cooked dinner over the fire and went to bed early. I woke up around 1 a.m. with the hair standing up on the back of my neck. The only thing I could hear was the creek roaring and the wind blowing. I remember feeling really uneasy, which was unusual because we camped out a lot and were very used to being out in the wilderness. I decided to get up and exit the tent. Immediately upon stepping out of the tent, I saw the outline of a man about 50 yards from our campsite. He was just standing still, staring down at our camp. I yelled up at him, but didn't get a response. I poked my head into the tent to wake my wife up, and when I looked back for the man, he was gone. My wife and I talked about it and agreed that it was probably an early hiker who was starting their summit push early. Both of us felt uneasy, and neither of us were able to go back to sleep. I laid in the tent for about another 45 minutes, wide awake. I decided to get back out of the tent and have a look around. I stepped out of the tent and walked around, still feeling a little uneasy. I didn't see anything, and still couldn't hear anything. I started going back towards my tent, and when I turned to my left, I saw the guy again. This time, he was very close, maybe 20 feet or so from our tent behind some brush. I yelled at him again and started running in his direction. He took off, and I lost sight of him. I got my wife out of the tent. We got all our stuff packed up and left. The 2-hour walk back to the car in the pitch black was honestly the most terrifying part of it all. Many years ago, on a road trip from LA to San Francisco, my husband and I stopped at a rest stop. We slept there for a couple of hours, and then when the sun rose, I went to use the restroom. Stepping inside, I noticed there were papers taped to the mirror. I had to use the toilet really bad, so I just stepped into the stall. Washing my hands after, I looked up and read the paper on the mirror before me. It said, "If you want a good time, call this number." Then it described what he was capable of doing, and how his extraordinary God-given attributes would be used in the process. Then, at the bottom of the paper, it said, "But if you don't want to call, I'll be right outside the door, by the big tree, waiting for you." My heart just went cold, and I froze. I didn't want to move, and I was looking around to see if he was in the restroom, feeling stupid for not reading that paper before or checking the stalls. I just stood there and waited for what seemed like an eternity for my husband to notice that I was gone too long. It wasn't that long, but it definitely felt that way. I ran out and grabbed my husband and went to the car. As we did, I looked back and sure enough, there was a guy by the tree, just outside the door, exactly the way he had described himself, the exterior part anyway. He looked at me, then quickly looked away. This was way before cell phones, so there was no way for me to call the police. Never again have I gone into a public bathroom and not checked. A British family's neighbor kept insisting that the kids were yelling insults and heckling him when they were outside playing in the garden. Only the father immediately knew it was nonsense because the kids were too afraid of the neighbor to even go outside. When the father confronted the neighbor for his lies, the neighbor threatened him, and expressly threatened the lives of the kids, the oldest no more than 6, making it clear that he'd teach those kids some manners. Naturally, the father calls the police. Here's where it gets worse. The neighbor's name was Harry Street, and when the police started investigating the threats, a junior officer noted that despite being close to his 70s, this incident taking place in 2013, none of Harry's public records started until the mid-90s. The junior officer immediately realized that Street was not only living under an assumed name, but an assumed name given to him by the government. That means he's an ex-con whose crimes were so notable that the police had to give him a fake name after his release for his own safety. But there are no clues to his former identity on his police records. Around the mid-90s is when they switched from paper records to computer databases, and sadly, it's not uncommon for some paper records to not have been transferred to the databases due to human error. Luckily, they still kept the original paper records just in case a situation like this ever arose. She went to get the paper from the storage facility, tracked down Street's real criminal record, and called the family in the middle of the night to warn them to get out of the house immediately, while also getting armed response to kick his door in, where they found an arsenal of handmade guns, ammo, and bombs. Harry Street was once known as Barry Williams, and as a result of psychotic and paranoid delusions caused by being an undiagnosed schizophrenic, Williams went on a killing spree provoked by his delusions in the 1970s. He was institutionalized for 20 years, until he was determined to recognize the error of his ways and the need to self-manage his condition. However, he emigrated to Spain right after his release. Without letting the police know about his past, he emigrated back to the UK a decade later. Williams had stopped taking his antipsychotic meds years ago, and his delusions were convincing him to go on another mass shooting. If not for that threat or the junior officer realizing his cover identity was fake, he'd have murdered his neighbors, just like when he started his first rampage. The scariest person I've met was my best friend from school. After 12 years of questionable choices, anger tantrums, and stalker-like behavior towards women, he decided the woman I had fallen for, and vice versa, was destined to be his by fate. He cornered her alone in the house and professed this predestiny while I was at work. We all lived in the same house. He showed her some old teenage drawing, and said he knew years prior to meeting that they would be together. She gave him the news that she and I were in a new relationship, and he began sticking screws into the couch and behaving erratically. He called a house meeting weeks later, and in front of both she and I and another housemate, said he was planning on killing us both in our sleep. He described the methods for each of us in detail. We left the house and moved out immediately. She and I were racked with paranoia and nightmares for months while living in another location. Pretty terrible way to ruin a friendship and terrify the supposed predestined love of your life. Driving across the country with my wife and dog, we stopped at a gas station around midnight. I was coming out of the bathroom. and I saw that the guy mopping the floor had stopped and was just staring out the window at my wife, who had finished letting the dog pee and was slowly walking back to the car. Turns out there was a super creepy guy slowly sneaking up behind her. He was like 20 feet back, but quietly getting closer, and my wife had no idea. I got out of the gas station real quick and loudly went over to them, hugged the dog, and said, "Let's get going." The second I walked over to them, the guy turned around and ran away. My wife never knew there was a guy sneaking up behind her until I told her once we got back on the road. When my son was a toddler, I made a late-night run to a 24-hour Walgreens to pick up a prescription for him. We lived in an urban area where that Walgreens was actually busy at that time of night. It was also right next to a metro stop and was not a place where most people drove, so parking was super limited. I ended up parking at a curb a little bit away from the store. When I got back to my car, a youngish, very normal by my estimation, guy came up to my window. I rolled it down a bit and he said, "I think I know you from a place in town." I had actually been to that place before, and it was also a very popular place, so I tried to remember him. In that split second that I hesitated trying to remember him, his eyes went completely black. His whole face changed, and he grabbed the door handle of my car and tried to open it. I put the car in drive and peeled out of there, looking straight ahead. Only when I got to a red light a few streets away did I realize that the overhead light was on. He had actually opened my door a bit, and I hadn't even realized. I never forgot his face, how it changed. I remember one of Ted Bundy's victims, a survivor obviously, who described how his face went from normal, attractive, and friendly to black-eyed, unrecognizable, and frenzied. That's how this man transformed. There were some missing women in our city, and I always wondered if this guy did it. I was 7. One of our neighbors was walking while I was playing in the yard. She asked me some questions. My mom came out and spoke to her. Everything seemed normal. My mom went back inside. Now I was playing with my dolls outside. Typical little girl playing with her baby doll. The neighbor leans in and starts talking to me. She says something like, "You could be my little dolly. Dress you, change you. You can be my pretty, helpless doll." Then I remember her giving me a kiss. I freaked out and ran inside. My mom came out and talked to her again. She didn't believe me. So I went to this music store to buy some strings for my violin. Because it was a 5-string, both an E, the highest on a violin, and C, the lowest on a viola, I had to buy a pack for a violin and the C string separately. I know this is boring, but it's all relevant, I promise. When I go to pay, the clerk helps put the C string into the other pack and hands it to me, without ringing it up, and I put it in my case and zip it up. The next day, he shows up at my door, having looked up my address, saying he can get me arrested for theft, and that it was on the cameras. I'm not sure how he thought he could turn that on me when it was clearly just neglect on his part, but the fact that he actually went that far to cover himself was pretty disturbing. Not very eventful compared to a lot of the stuff on here, but I thought I'd share it anyway. I went to uni a few hours from home, and spent every second weekend or so traveling a few hours by bus to go see my then boyfriend. I got on one morning and quite happily sat with my book, just reading away. It was mostly students and young people, but there was one older guy, maybe in his 50s, who kept changing seats every so often. It was fairly quiet, so it wasn't like he was trying to get a free seat. He moved next to me just as we got to a busy stop, and then the whole bus was at capacity. Fine by me, I was just minding my own business. After a while, he starts asking what I'm reading. It's a generic novel, a bit of a murdery police thriller type thing. I tell him, and he starts going off about how young women like me are terrible people and will never be good enough for men. Starts mocking me for reading trash and how I don't use my brain. And I tell him I'm at uni, and he starts laughing at the course I'm doing because women have no place in a man's world. Bear in mind, I'm 18 at the time, from a small place and used to people striking up conversation, so I just sit and listen to him. He starts to get really venomous about how I'm what's wrong with women these days, and how someone should do something about it. I get to the point where I stand up because I'm willing to get off the bus in the middle of nowhere to get away from this crate. I stand up, and one guy a few rows back asks if I'll swap seats with him. The guy next to me starts going off about how ridiculous it is that I won't just have a chat with him. The guy sits beside him while I move, but the creepy dude just sits and stares over his shoulder. I pretended to get off at the next city by going downstairs, and could see him out the window looking around for me, thinking it was my stop. Before he clocked, I was still on the bus. He tried to get back on, until the dude who swapped with me came down to stop him. Reader, I married him. Only joking, of course. I was really into hitchhiking in California years ago. 99% of the drivers were super cool, and I made great memories. And then about 1 in 100 drivers were creepy, or just really weird. So many crazy stories. The craziest and creepiest was on a month-long hitchhiking trip up and down the 101. In the middle of the night, I got picked up by a van. Almost immediately when I entered the car, I got some yellow flags. Trash everywhere, a rancid stank, and the dude was morbidly and visually unclean. I tried to make a little small talk and introduce myself as usual, but he didn't respond, just kept driving. Red flag number 1 was the first thing this dude said to me, in a serious tone. Haven't been a lot of murders this year, have there? I nervously laughed and started thinking about an exit plan. Red flag number 2 was when I realized the van locks had been cut off. They were the pop up and down door locks, and they were just chopped down, so I couldn't unlock the door. I started freaking out a little bit, and he was also driving really fast. I ended up faking like I was sick and about to throw up. I got him to pull over, but he didn't turn off the car or unlock the doors. I frantically climbed into the back of the van and jimmied the trunk open. I then sprinted into the forest. Still gives me chills to think about that encounter to this day. Dude had such an angry yet quiet energy. Unfortunately, I was far from home, so I had to hitchhike back. After I ran into the woods, I was so freaked out, because I thought he might run after me. He didn't drive away, just stalled on the side of the highway, so I just kept running deeper and deeper into the redwoods, frantically trying to find a house. I ended up running into a property finally, and there was a half-finished house and some dude smoking a cigar. He calmed me down and made me some soup, and told me I could sleep under his partially finished house, which was a little funny since it was pretty much just a few boards and no roof. In the morning, I helped him nail a few planks, then headed back to the highway. Still a little shook from that night. After that last trip, I never hitched again. I came back home and was like, yep, I'm good. Hitchhiking is fun to some degree, but there's always a percentage of serious danger, and these days it's only growing bigger. This encounter was in the early 2000s, so the dude might still be out there cruising for hitchhikers. Looking back on it and really thinking about everything, it's obvious I either ran into an actual serial killer or a wannabe serial killer.